Now, recently, you may have noticed there has been a massive increase in interest in Afro-derived hairstyles. These are hairstyles such as the twisting of hair, lock-in or dreadlocks, braids or plaits, and cane row or cornrow. And all of these hairstyles, which are traditionally Afro-derived hairstyles, seem to be getting practiced outside of the Black and or Afro and or African community. Now, this rise in interest has also led to an interesting and increasingly circulated rumor that actually these hairstyles are not Afro-derived hairstyles, but actually have their origin outside of Black and African culture in Scandinavia amongst the Vikings. So I thought it would be interesting for us to look into this claim and see if there's any truth to it.
Find wearing braids disrespectful, or they're calling it cultural appropriation. Please explain to me how this is cultural appropriation. There's nothing wrong with this hairstyle. Vikings literally are the ones that created braids in the first place.
These right here are actually Viking dreadlocks, and I wear them to better connect with my own ancestral lineage. I strongly believe that we should be super respectful and connected to our ancestors and their way of life and all of these things. There isn't only one culture.
Now, I believe a lot of today's modern Viking obsession is linked to the increased exposure that people have to this culture in modern media. There's a particular show called Vikings, which is incredibly popular, and this show depicts, Vikings with a lot of these hairstyles. Now, because the Vikings appear so cool in a lot of these shows, and there's this massive idea of being linked to some kind of warrior lineage, if you say that you come from the Vikings. I'm thinking about How to Train Your Dragon and a lot of these shows that are out there that really depict obviously Viking culture as being stoic and pure and warrior, and it's very cool culture to want to associate yourself with. But it's also important to note that Viking is not something that you can point your ancestry to. What they're talking about is having Scandinavian ancestry. If you look at the etymology of Viking, it could come from Old Norse, which suggests that it means one who operates a bay, or some even older or Proto-Indo-European origin somewhere on the Germanic side, suggesting that it comes from the word wick, which means to move around or to travel around. So we have these origins, but the point is a Viking is essentially a medieval pirate, and that's what they were. But they definitely were not a lineage. When people say they come from Viking lineage, what they're saying is I come from a Scandinavian lineage, which is different because Viking itself is actually a profession. So saying I come from Viking ancestry is like saying I come from farmer ancestry, or saying I come from fisherman ancestry. It doesn't quite work that way. This also meant that Vikings could be multicultural. Viking is not a legitimate ethnographic group. Viking culture, if you want to call it that, isn't even that old. If we look at the Viking era, it's really an era that extended from around 700 AD to 1000 AD. If you're looking for Vikings proper, if you want to stretch it back to their actual origins of this kind of Norse society, we're going back as far as about 500 AD. So as far back as you can push the Vikings, you would say maybe is about 1500 years. So if you're going to make the claim that the Vikings originated dreadlocks, cane rows, twists, plaits and braids, if you're going to make this claim, then you're going to essentially say that this is how old these styles are, 1500 years old. So it becomes very easy then to disprove whether or not the Vikings did or did not create these styles, because essentially all you have to do is find an older application of these hairstyles that predates the 1500 years that the Vikings go back, and it turns out that that's actually really easy to do. Let's take, for instance, the ancient Egyptians. We have many examples of ancient Egyptian mummies that we know are dated far beyond this 1500 years. So for instance, I could show you this mummy of Queen Nojmet, which dates back to about 1100 BC, 2000 years older than our Viking example. And you can see these are very clearly plaited braided hair. There's no ambiguity about that. In fact, we can stretch back another 400 to 500 years and we can get Queen Amos Nefertari here and Lady Rai, whose hair is both in braids. You can see clearly braided African hair here. And here's what's really interesting: is actually protocol for Egyptian noble women and queens, obviously, to be buried with their hair in braids and plaits. So this is going back undoubtedly, if we're looking at mummy samples, we're looking at 4,000 years, some 4,500 year old mummies that we can find with braided hair, which obviously 3,000 years now, we're talking about exceeding the age of the Vikings. Not only that, but it's not just braids, it's all of the Afro derivative hairstyles. For instance, we can look at the statue of Djoser if we want a really classic and old example of some of the first and earliest examples of hair being shown in dreadlocks. And not just Djoser, we can see this in Amenemhat III statue here from the Middle Kingdom. So we have Old Kingdom dating back, now we're talking about getting closer to 5,000 years. Middle Kingdom, we're talking about 4,000 years old in Amenemhat III. So some really old classical examples of Africans with their hair in these stars. And obviously, if we look on the walls of the ancient Egyptians, we know that these stars weren't just practiced in ancient Egypt, they were practiced all across classical Africa. You can see images of Cushites with their hair in these styles. You can see images of Nubians with their hair in these styles. You can see, I think some of the oldest examples of platinum braiding go back to ancient Namibia and ancient Libya, who both have examples of hair being plaited around 6,000 years ago. And it looks like this was an expression of a modern African group called the Wadabi culture, who practice these hairstyles to this very day. So this lock-in and this plaiting and the practicing of these Afro-derived hairstyles really does go back as far as the human record can be traced, particularly amongst African people. So when it comes to a situation of discussing the date of which people had these hairstyles first, there's no shadow of a doubt that Africans and people with Afro-derived hair have been doing these styles for much, much longer than Europeans have. A lot of what we take as proof for the Vikings doing it is actually just reenactorism gone a bit rogue, i.e. people seeing, these modern people cosplay as Vikings, and a lot of it is rumor but unsubstantiated. Now, if we're going to look at the origin of where these rumors are, I think I've found a couple of good examples as to where these rumors about Vikings having dreadlocks and cornrows and plaits and cane rows, etc., I think I've got a good example of where these rumors might have come from. We have an Anglo-Saxon chronicler called John of Wallingford, who lived in the 13th century, and he described the Vikings as having hair that was combed and oiled to resemble snakes, which is likely intended to emphasize their fearsome and exotic appearance. Now, as you can hear, he did say that their hair resembled snakes, and a lot of people would say, well, resembling snakes, then they must have had some kind of locking in their hair. But that seems somewhat contradicted by the preceding term, which is combed and oiled. Anyone who knows the locking or plaiting process knows you can't comb any locked or plaited hair. Once the style's in, all you can really do is retwist the roots. So combed and oiled to resemble snakes probably suggests some kind of a slick hairstyle, but not necessarily in locks or cane rows or plaits or braids. In fact, I think most people who actually have these hairstyles will tell you that this seems like a bit of an impossibility. Let's see if there's any more examples. If we go a little bit earlier to the 10th century, we have an Arab traveler called Ibn Fadlan, and his description says, "But as for their hair, they wear it long and they comb it every day. Sometimes they tie it up in a knot and sometimes they let it hang loose like ropes." So it's this quote of their hair hanging loose like ropes, once again, similar to the snakes, that has got people thinking, well, maybe they had some kind of derivative of dreadlocks or plaits going on. But once again, it suffers from the same problems that we have with the quote from John of Wallingford, in that he describes before the fact that it hang loose like ropes, that they wear it long and they comb it every day. Now, what's really interesting is that the Vikings themselves were known for having really good hygiene. In fact, when they came to England, many of them were threatened by the English because the English women preferred them because of their hygiene and the keeping of their hair. They were essentially a lot cleaner than the native English people. But one of the things they were noted for was their hair care.
In the published study titled Viking Age Hair, research Elizabeth Arville Nordblad states the following regarding hair care in the Viking Age. For women, the most common coiffure was a long ponytail, coiled into a knot close to the head, sometimes called the Irish ribbon knot. Occasionally the ponytail was plain. Next in popularity was the top knot. Among the men, the majority of the pictures showed them with short hair. However, about 1/3 of her sample wore their hair in a plait. For men, in addition to grooming their hair, a well-groomed beard might also have been important, signifying rank and status. It is seemingly noteworthy that the nicknames of two of the most renowned Viking leaders, Svein Forkbeard and Harold the Fairhair, referred to their hair.
The Vikings did actually have their own hairstyles. And if we look at a few Viking artifacts, we can start to get a really clear picture about who the Vikings truly were. You can see they had this kind of reverse mullet hairstyle if we have a look at this artifact, and that is much closer to the kind of hairstyles that Vikings would wear. We also see many examples of Vikings simply just wearing their hair long, letting it hang loose like ropes or loose like snakes, probably heavily oiled, which maybe caused their hair to kind of like band into thicker strands. And this is where I'd suggest that perhaps what we're seeing is a little bit of fabrication, a little bit of obsession with African culture or Afro hair culture, and a desire to impose a style that didn't seem to be indigenous to that region.
Women flaunted intricate cornrows not just for style, but as symbols of status. Inspired by this history, people embraced Viking-inspired braids, seamlessly blending ancient charm with modern style. Contemporary stylists draw inspiration from historical depictions to revamp Viking cornrows. They're giving this ancient hairstyle a fresh and fabulous makeover, earning Vikings' approval. Viking women's cornrows, beyond their symbolic significance, served a practical purpose, keeping hair tidy during daily activities.
There's no doubt that Africans definitely practiced this style before Europeans, and I'm not saying that as some kind of flex. It's only natural. It's a natural African hairstyle. The twisting, locking, braiding, cane rowing of hair requires and actually is exemplified by naturally curly or coily hair. That's what keeps it in place. That's why you don't need additional bindings to make African cane row or African twists or African plaits or African locks stay in place. The hair is self-locking, and this is why these hairstyles are natural, and that's why it's not really a big deal to find black African Afro-haired people practicing these styles. It's just the natural way that we've learned to style and to manage our hair, which grows very differently to your modern European hair. So to suggest that the hairstyles which we practice naturally and which complements the way that our hair grows and complements the self-care of African hair, to suggest that these styles came from elsewhere and we copied them from Vikings isn't only insulting, it's actually really nonsensical. It doesn't have any basis in reality, and this is so much of what seems to happen with African cultural norms. The idea that the braids were some kind of warrior symbol, it sounds great, it sounds really interesting, but unfortunately it just has little or no basis in reality. There's not really much in the way of weighty evidence to suggest that braiding was ever that popular, and this is logical. As I've mentioned, braiding is a natural byproduct of having curly or tightly curled hair. It allows people with curly hair to access longer hairstyles. It allows them to protect their hair. It allows them to keep their hair within a style and not have to give it really tiresome daily regiment and routines. There's so much benefit that comes to those with African or Afro or curly hair, to which braids, locks, cane rows provide such an efficient and attractive answer to. So it's just really a natural evolution and byproduct of the African hair experience. I guess where the issue lies and where the offense is caused is when, as a result of liking this culture that you've inherited, this culture that people of African descent or Afro hair or black people have gifted to the world, you then try to remove it from them and try to make it your own in an effort to not attribute credit. Even more egregious is to then take that culture and to say that you passed it onto black people, onto those of Afro hair. It's incredibly insulting, and as you can see, it's just totally unsupported. What really is it that people love about these cultures so much? It's not just because they're Viking, it's because they look cool. And the question has to be asked, well, why do they look cool? And the answer is, uncomfortably for many, it's because they're aligning themselves with a culture that we attribute to black people. That's what makes them cool, and it's happening on a subconscious level. Think about all of the black cultures or all of the African or Afro cultures that are exported to the rest of the world. Think about the way that we speak, our language, be it the patois of the Jamaicans, the pidgin of the West Africans, or the Ebonics of the African American or African American vernacular English. These are all regarded as being very cool derivatives of the English language. Think about the way that we dress, how we can wear essentially what's available to everybody else, but put it together in such a way that it then becomes cool. Think about our hairstyles, and let's put these long hairstyles aside and just think about our haircuts in both male and female general culture. The skin fade has become the de facto hairstyle that everyone runs to if they want to be perceived as being cool. Once again, think about the sports that we pick up. They inevitably become the cool sports. So it seems, and obviously our music, every genre of black music is associated with coolness, is associated with a underlying culture. So it doesn't surprise that these hairstyles, when they're worn amongst the Vikings, makes the Vikings look a bit cooler. I mean, they could just make the Vikings wear the hair that they knew that Vikings wore, but this isn't cool. Look at the examples of people when they get their hair done in Viking styles, and what is the underlying message of when these people get their hair done in these Viking styles? It's that they look cool.
I've been waiting for my hair to be long enough to do this, a fucking Viking braid. I mean, just look at this. Look at this shit. Tell me that doesn't look fucking fantastic. Do you have any idea?
Cool is just a euphemism for black. Cool is a euphemism for Afro culture. This Viking hairstyles, Viking dreadlocks, Viking braids, all of this is just an effort to make the Vikings cooler. You know, it's not rooted in any reality. Look at Ragnar, who everyone thinks is such a cool king. Look at his hairstyle. It's essentially a fade with long locks at the top. This is just a very quintessential black Afro style that you might find amongst several African cultures or black cultures or Afro cultures. It's a black hairstyle, but it's a black hairstyle that has been exported outside of its African or Afro or black context, and it makes it really interesting. Acknowledge it. If it was truly a Viking hairstyle, you wouldn't have to call it Viking braids. There's no black or African person who goes into a salon and asks for African braids or African cornrow or African twists. They just ask for braids, cornrow, and twists, and everyone knows what they mean. So the fact that you have to append the word Viking at the start of these hairstyles in an effort to make it not African only proves that by default it is, and everybody knows which culture these hairstyles are associated with. Since time immemorial now, Black culture has been fetishized, and that is something that isn't slowing up. It's not changing. It's just that people are finding ways to take Black culture and not give credit back to the Black and Afro and African communities that create these cultures. And that really is where the issue lies. So in short, there really isn't any evidence that any of these styles can be attributed to any other culture than Black, African, and or Afro cultures. Those people with that naturally curly, naturally tightly curled hair. It's unanimous across our various cultures that we practice these kinds of hairstyles. And I guess the larger question or debate lies in maybe which of the various Black cultures was perhaps the first to execute a cane-row / cornrow or twist or lock. That is a debate to be had. But whether or not, braids started amongst those of Black / Afro culture, there's really not even a discussion to be had about it. There's no evidence to suggest that braids started anywhere outside of those populations of Black / African people. So in short, that brings this discussion, I hope, to a bit of a conclusion. African hairstyles will remain African hairstyles, and I hope you found that informative. If you did, make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you haven't liked the video yet, then, come on, help me out here. And obviously, if anyone wants to support me on Patreon, you can see the link in the description. Thank you for joining me on the King's Monologue, and I will certainly see you, I hope, on my next video. Peace. Have a fantastic day.